This is Dr. Mark Trexler with the Climate Countdown. There's an old adage that you manage what you measure, and climate scientists are measuring lots of things. There's carbon dioxide, CO2, concentrations in the atmosphere, which have risen from 278 parts per million ppm in pre-industrial times to 415 ppm today, and they're growing at 2.5 ppm per year. If you include the warming from the greenhouse gases methane and nitrous oxide, CO2 equivalent concentrations are already above 500 ppm. Then there's emissions. We've emitted more than 2 trillion tons of CO2 equivalent to date. More than 40 billion tons of CO2 are emitted per year, about 20% from land use change. 50% of emitted CO2 has historically remained in the atmosphere, while the rest has been absorbed by the oceans and forests. That's the equivalent of 3 Hiroshima-sized nuclear bombs worth of energy getting dumped into the oceans every second. Then there's temperature. The planet overall has warmed about 1.2 degrees centigrade and will probably warm by between 2 and 5 degrees centigrade during the rest of this century. But in the Arctic, we're looking at more than 10 degrees centigrade. Not to mention other impacts. Sea levels are expected to rise 2 to 3 feet, but it might be 10 feet. 100 million people might need to migrate north to escape heat and crop failures. What used to be 100-year return period storms are now 20-year return period storms. And don't forget mitigation. There's the trillion-ton carbon budget and net zero by 2050. There's the billions of tons of carbon that could be stored in agricultural soils, the $100 billion committed to climate finance, and the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 25% per decade to stand a 66% chance of achieving the global 2-degree target. Is there a problem with all these numbers? I think so. First, they give us a great deal to debate. Has the Earth warmed by 1.2 or 1.1 degrees? Is the global warming potential of methane compared to CO2 20 or 80? Will we hit 1.5 degrees in 2030 or 2040? Did climate change increase the chance of that big fire by 10% or 60%? There's plenty to argue over. But the real problem is that most of these numbers don't mean much to most people. Few people get what average global temperature really means. It doesn't even actually exist anywhere on the planet. Or what's so magical about a 2-degree C temperature target? I'll bet that my reference to Hiroshima bomb energy equivalents going into the ocean was one of the few numbers that really hit home. The bottom line is that getting the public to grasp and respond to climate risk doesn't have much to do with numbers. We've embarked on a planetary scale experiment to see what happens when you rapidly release enormous quantities of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, using as our test subject the only planet in the universe known to support life. It's a pretty bizarre experiment when you think about it, and a blizzard of climate-relevant numbers hasn't done much to dissuade us from running the experiment. Greenhouse gas emissions, for example, have basically increased every year for the last 30 years. Average global temperature is steadily increasing, and we're waiting to see if or when we'll trigger potentially disastrous positive feedbacks. We need to start focusing less on numbers and more on values. This is Mark Trexler with the Climate Countdown. Access more information at our website, climatecountdown.climatesites.net. And thanks for listening.